we are on page 3, I think, or almost. We are on the bottom of page 2. Does that sound right, Robin? Possession? I said it was going to start the next page.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because I was looking through my notes trying to find some answers.
Yep, and last week we talked all about closing dates and this loan approval section that we talked about that, you know, if your closing date is 30 days, then you might want to put this at 30 days because then you have this extra 5 days from here. 5, that's 35, so 30 or 35 days to close the file. You could put 25 and 5, and that makes 30 and 30, and that's fine too. Or you could try to sucker in some extra time by putting this date 30 days out. Then this date, because that's going to be a calendar date, you'll see it popping up there.
Right.
Or, and then if you've got a problematic lender, you can, because like I said, most people look at this line. So your listing agent is likely going to look at this line. They're going to go, oh, look, they'll close in 30 days, talking to their seller. Well, yeah, we might, but we put 45 here, 5 days here. That makes 50 days, even though we put a date in that was 30 days away, because it's whichever's later. So we talked all about that stuff. We talked about contingencies, but we'll go through the addendums and such later. But now we're down. We talked about wire fraud a bunch. Now we're here at possession. Possession of the property shall be delivered to buyer at, and then you've got 3 options. I know there's a lot of boxes and lines right in this little spot. You got 3 options. At closing, you can pick one option. I'm sure there's a scenario where 2 options might make sense, but I don't know that I've ever encountered one. If I have, it's been a long time. So, buyer at closing. What does that mean? That means you're not going back home after closing, Mr. Seller. Okay? It means the buyer can drive straight from closing to the house. Second option, that's the easy one. That's normal. When you're talking to your especially older clients, they come from a generation that I don't remember, which was it was, at least their perspective is, it was a given that you stayed 30 days after closing. You sold your house and stayed there for 30 days. They just think that. And the last thing you want is grandma being shocked after you sent her 57 emails that she didn't read with very clear instructions and everything, that she has to move out at closing. So that's why we talk about every element of the contract with your clients. Go over it with them. Send it to them. Tell them to read it. Ask them if they have any questions. Highlight major portions. Whatever you need to do. Make sure that they're comfortable. And you're going to learn that if you're astute with your client. You're going to know how smart they are, how well read they are, how well they understand things. You have to explain things 10 times or 1 time. And you'll know how deep you have to dive into everything. But possession at closing. That's easy. That's normal. Now, it's become normal because of the stupid seller market that we're in, that we give sellers time after closing. That's just been part of it. I've had 6 months for only the cost of the person's new mortgage payment or their apartment payment, whichever is less, right? We've done all kinds of stuff. But this second 2 are going to be related to time after closing. This box, if you check it, is going to say within a certain number of days, beginning the day after closing, by a certain time. Okay, and then that one's over. I know it's hard to read these because there's no delineations. They should be in my opinion, they should be, vertically stacked, not written in a long line like this. But they didn't do that. Whatever. They won't let me in the crew that writes these contracts. Maybe someday they will. But within how many days? So 3 days, 7 days, 2 days, 5 days, beginning the day after closing, which is guaranteed. That already, I'm going to say something here that's coming up. Time is of the essence. Says day 1 is always the day after, right? Baby is 0 today. If it's born today, it's 1 day old birthday thing is tomorrow, right? Hey, look, today you're 1 day old because you were born yesterday, right? So contracts and stuff are the same way, at least this one, regarding the time is of the essence clause. And this just reiterates that, although that's redundant. But it's within 5 days, beginning the day after closing, and you pick a time. Normally, I pick 5 p.m.-ish. That's normal. 11:59 p.m. is fine, even though that's redundant, because if there's no time mentioned, it's always 11:59 p.m. based on the time is of the essence clause. So you can just, whatever makes sense. What you don't really want is to make it a situation where your buyer feels weird, or your seller. This all applies to your seller too, where it's like, well, we thought we were getting it on Friday, but we really don't get it till Saturday because it's 11:59 p.m. Like it's midnight between Friday and Saturday. So that's why that matters. That's why it's good to understand how that works. So I've got one that's 6 p.m., 5 p.m., though 3 p.m., noon, whatever seems to make sense. Normally people aren't picky, but the key is explaining it. If it's 11:59 p.m. or 10 p.m. at night, explain to your client, listen, you're not really going to get, I mean, you can go there at midnight. That's fine. It's yours. But the reality is it looks on paper like you're getting it Friday, but you're really getting it Saturday morning at 9 when you wake up. All right. And then the third section, which is my cursor's on now, on or before blank if closed. This is where you select an actual date, as you can see there. So then we check this one and we go on or before. I don't use that one very often because most of the time people are looking for, well, we'll explain. So this is on or before a certain date. What time of day is this section then? You don't see a spot where you can put a time.
Right.
So what time is it?
Midnight.
11:59 p.m.
Yeah.
Yep, because that's what it always is if there is no time written. Always 11:59 p.m. So 3 options: at closing, within a certain number of days, or on a specific date. 3 ways to go about it, because sometimes people, we don't really care how long it is after closing. We just want it by March 3rd. If that's 1 day after closing, great. If that's 20 days after closing, great. The seller wants to stay until March 3rd at 5 p.m. Great. So that's when we would go on or before March 3rd if closed. Further conditions, you could add 5 p.m. if you really needed to, right? So those are the 3 sections. At closing, which means seller doesn't go back home, buyer gets it immediately. All the seller's crap's got to be gone. No trucks in the yard, no trash in the driveway. It's the other person's house. Within a certain number of days, that's the most common other than at closing. It's the most common because somebody's just going, I don't want to pack my entire house and then you don't close. I don't want to load my entire truck and be gone at closing and then you not close. So 2 days, 3 days, 5 days is pretty normal there. And then pick a time or a specific date. That's going to happen a lot when somebody's building a new home, when they've got a new job that they're starting, when they're trying to get out of an apartment. I don't know. There's lots of reasons why a date could work. It is the least common one, though. But what you don't do is do something like within 5 days, beginning the day after closing, or on or before July 5th. You don't pick them both because you just said 2 different things. You said 5 days or July 5th if we're closed, and those could be conflicting. And it doesn't say whichever is later. So that otherwise that would clear it up. It's you just said 2 different things and now it's confusing, okay? Now, this is not hard, but people don't pay attention to it. Agents don't understand it. For each day, seller is entitled to possession after closing. Seller shall pay to buyer at closing X number of dollars per day. Okay, stop. Period is there. If we give them permission in this section to stay after closing, the seller can stay. Are we charging them or not? The answer is up to the buyer. Yes, no, maybe so. You put 0. Spacebar always gets you to the spot where you can just type 0. If you don't want to charge them for those days, those 5 days after closing. If you want to charge them for the days, then you could put 100. You're going, Eli, why in the world is there a template item where it's 100, even when most of the time we mark it at closing? Why would I do that? Anybody have an idea? Why would I leave it like that? They have no entitled days after closing for possession. We've said you have to get out at closing. However, for any days that we let you stay after closing, like on purpose, you have to pay us $100. You're like, Eli, it's kind of like the gas. Remember the home heating fuel? There's no home heating fuel, but I said I want it all. Well, because I can always take all of nothing, right? So that's fine. What about this one? Why do you think I do that? Anybody can answer. Anybody cannot answer. I'll just answer it. Ready? The reason is because if this gets changed, if we change from at closing to 3 days after, somewhere down the line, oh no, our new build got backed up 3 days. And the agent on the other end of the deal, the seller agent, writes to us and says, hey, here's an amendment. We got to back our new build up 3 days. Great. No problem. We're flexible. She sends an amendment. Seller to deliver possession 3 days after closing, beginning the day after closing at 5 p.m. And she doesn't change that this is zero. Guess what? You just made your clients $300 because the seller already agreed to pay $100 per day for anything after closing.
So you only put that if it's at closing?
Nope, that is going to stay there all the time. Unless you want to change it to be more aggressive. It's strategy. This is default. Default is okay in most cases because we're saying the agent on the other end may very well go, what an idiot. I can't believe Eli just said that we have to pay him $100 a day for days after closing when there's no days after closing because he marked out closing. And I go, yeah, I'm an idiot. And then that same agent sends me an amendment 2 weeks later that gives them a week after closing a possession and doesn't change the $100 down to zero, and I just made my client $700. Yeah, I'm an idiot. Yep, idiot that just made $700. That's why that's there. Now, if you are going to mark one of the other ones, then you need to deal with that line, right? If you're going to mark this one or you're going to mark this one, you need to deal with that line because if you have it at $100 a day for 5 days, you may not get the offer accepted because they're thinking, why would I pay you $500? I got 47 offers lined up. So you might change that to zero, or you might change it to 50, or you might change it to 25, whatever makes sense for your client and their strategy for getting their offer accepted. So this is a valuable line, but default is this at closing and this. At closing is not actually default. Default is nothing marked. But if you mark at closing, don't change that. Because what if they forget to change it to zero? You just made your clients a bunch of money. Okay? You will occasionally get countered, and that'll be marked as zero. Fine. Then you just got to be the good agent that knows if you do give them possession, ask your client if they have to pay for it or not. But that's what that is. Notice, for each day the seller's entitled. This is they have permission. This is not against our will. This is permissive possession after closing. Seller pays to buyer at closing $100 per day. This is not paid as we go. If they have 30 days at $50 a day, that's $1,500 that they have to pay the buyer at closing, at the table. Okay? That is cash, check, whatever. It's rent money. It has nothing to do with the sale of a home. However, so I want to note that one, it's at closing, you get paid. You can come up with new plans, right? This doesn't have to be the plan. You can go to further conditions, come up with new plans. We've done plans where they paid, they're basically staying there for 6 months afterwards, and the first 3 months they pay up front at closing, and then the remaining 3 months they're going to pay on the first of each month like normal rent. We've come up with different options. Work with me on those. But normal is the $300 you owe, pay it to them at closing, and there's no refunds, there's none of that stuff. This is entitled to possession, not entitled and took advantage of. Like, well, we moved out 3 days early. Doesn't matter. You were entitled to stay there for those 3 days. So you go back and live there again. I don't care. Like, it's done. It's yours until then. If you call me and tell me to move in early, we'll move in, but you're not getting your money back. Again, unless you've come up with a new plan. The other thing I was going to point out is the lenders do not like this section. So, in my opinion, I know this goes on the internet, but I'm making a new decision afterwards. If I'm going to agree that we're going to do $100 in a day rental, that's a lot, but that's like Airbnb version. That's expensive. That's $3,000 a month. But let's say it was $100 a day rental back because of this post-closing possession. The lender is not going to want the seller giving the buyer money. They just, even if it doesn't make logical sense why, in this sort of case, a lot of times it makes sense. but in this case, it doesn't necessarily make sense to me. They're still not going to like it. So you're going to want to potentially rewrite your contract afterwards. So you're going to purchase agreement with $100 a day written in there, send it to the seller. Seller agrees. We're under contract. I call the listing agent. Hey, list agent, this is not going to go well if we send this PA to the lender. They're not going to let us do this post-closing possession thing. So we need to do one of two things. Either we need to rewrite it as a closing cost provision. So we owe you $3,000 right now, or you owe us $3,000 right now as the buyer. Seller owes the buyer $3,000. Why don't we change that into closing cost concession? Then the lender's not going to have a problem, and you can do that on an amendment. Or, hey, this is not going to go well. I'm going to send you a new purchase agreement with possession at closing, and then we're going to write an amendment to that, or an addendum changing that from possession at closing to possession just like we have it in our current PA, and then we'll just sign all new documents and send what we need. So you do that initial negotiating up front, and then you just kind of rewrite it the way a lender's going to want to see it. That way you don't have to have all these crazy conversations up front with an agent when he's got 20 offers he's looking at. So there's been plenty of times where I tell the listing agent, listen, we wrote it this way because we want to be clear, and you don't want to have to do a bunch of weird stuff up front. But then once we're under contract, I'll rewrite a new one, and we'll make sure it's all clean for the listing agent. Another time you might do that, another perfect example of that, and you're not even trying to get around a lender thing. If you have 14 counter offers, it just got crazy. All kinds of stuff changing. You got all these counter offers. You finally come to a conclusion, you're buying the house. It's awesome. But write a new purchase agreement, that kind of, what would be the word there? That congeals all of that into the purchase agreement. Take all 14 of those counter offers, reduce them down into the purchase agreement, and re-sign it. And then send the one PA to the lender instead of 14 counter offers. Okay, that's another example of how you might do that and why that might be wise. So this section was, when are we getting possession and what are we paying for the entitled possession period? During this time, well, we'll get down to this. All right, top of page 3. If seller does not deliver possession by the time and date required in the first sentence, right here, seller shall pay buyer X number of dollars per day as liquidated damages until possession is delivered to buyer. And buyer shall have all other legal and equitable remedies available against the seller. So, this is what I write in there. $1,000. If you do not leave when you are supposed to, you owe me $1,000 a day. Well, Eli, isn't that a little excessive? No, I want you out of the house. If I put that at $250, and let's say you got another 3 days until you can move into your new build, and we didn't agree to give it to you, and we closed anyway, and you need 3 more days, I'll take $3,000 for those 3 days. My inconvenience, that's probably $3,000. That's fine. Are you going to want to pay $3,000 to stay at your house? I don't know, but if I put it at $250, you better darn well know that you're going to stay in that house. Why would somebody leave? $250, they can't rent a hotel room, let alone 2 trucks to store all their stuff for 3 days. And while, all of their stuff's getting heat warped in the trucks, I mean, the amount of problems for the seller are really high if they leave for 3 days before they can move into their next place. Multiple trucks rented for multiple days. They have to find somewhere to stay. They have to eat out the whole time. I mean, it is a high problem for a seller. So this dollar figure better match it. Otherwise, they're going to stay in your new house. They'd be silly not to. If this is $250 a day, I'm staying. I'm not going to rent 2 trucks for $150 each every day and stay in a hotel room for 2 hotel rooms because I've got 4 kids, let's say. I got to stay in 2 hotel rooms. So now I'm $500 a day in hotel rooms, $300 a day in trucks, and then inconvenience of easily $200 a day. So that's why this number's got to match. $500, okay, but I still feel like the math I just did, I'm going to stay in the house. And I'm going to hope you don't sue me for more, but I'm going to stay in the house and you guys can go rent the hotel rooms. And guess what? Your poor buyer, they've got trucks loaded, right? They've got 2 trucks loaded. Well, no, they got 1 truck loaded, but they've got to get out of their house. So now they're going to have to go rent a second truck for a super high price. So they're at $300 a day in trucks. They've got to go stay in a hotel room for 2 days. Oh, 2 of them because they got 6 kids. They got $800, $1,000, $1,500 a day. And then the inconvenience fee of who knows what, because now work and like, how do you, I mean, it's horrible. So the first time you get caught in this situation with some people pay $50, they get into some weird habit to make these 2 numbers the same, 100 and 100.
Oh God, can you imagine?
Yes, I can. Brent's got a great story about it. And where his lady's a lawyer, or not his lady, the seller was a lawyer and goes, I can't go anywhere he'd written $250 a day in it or something. The story, Brent can tell it better, but there was $250 in there. The lawyer lady that owns the house that sold it to his clients goes, where am I going to go for $250 a day with trucks and stays and across the country and all this stuff? I'll just wait here until my house is ready. She stayed there for like 2 weeks. Paid $250 a day. She's like, that's a deal. It's cheaper than my Airbnb.
I'm sure buyers are fine with that.
Now, the buyers, if we look, so now you guys fully grasp, this is for unpermissive staying. They are staying too long. Now, listen, this is the reason this number is high because now it's in writing that we all already saw this number and agreed to this number. However, the buyer shall have all other legal and equitable remedies available against the seller. So there is more damages allowed in the contract if they sue the seller. Most people won't sue, which is fine. I'm good with people not wanting to sue a bunch of people. I know there's religious stuff and there's financial stuff and there's personal stuff and there's emotions, and there's time, there's all these things involved in the lawsuits, but it's there. So that $1,000 is not the end. That is the beginning. The judge is going to look at the contract and goes, guys, I don't even know why we're here. Like, I know for a fact you're paying $1,000 a day. Are you paying more is the question. And the buyer's probably going to have to show proof of expenses and stuff. And they may absolutely get more. And they may get some of those damages that aren't actually financial. They may be like health and sanitary. And I don't know. I'm just making stuff up. I don't know. But whatever it is, where it's inconvenience and I miss days of work and on and on and on. So, you know, don't assume that there's a limit to this, but $1,000, I mean, once or twice in the last few years, I've gotten a question about that. Like, why $1,000? That's a little much, Eli. I'm like, no, here's my answer to that agent that calls me and says, Eli, that's crazy. We're not paying $1,000 a day to stay at the house. Hold on. Clarify that for me. You're planning on staying longer than we agree upon? Well, no. Well, okay. Well, the first line says you can stay there for 5 days for $0. The second line says if you break the contract, are absolutely in breach, and screw us over, you're going to pay $1,000 a day. Are you planning on doing that? Well, no. Well, then why does it matter? I might as well put $10 million in there then. If you're not going to do it, this number is irrelevant. Okay. And I've never changed it. Never had to have it changed to win an offer. Because nobody's going to admit up front that they're going to break the contract.
Right.
That's why it's, I don't know, I say all this stuff not because I think like I'm the genius. I say this because it's effective, and I want you guys to have this total, because these conversations will come up. And if you can go back to, boy, Eli did something with that. What did he say when that agent said something about that $1,000? You know, your delivery is going to be different than mine. I'm positive of that. I'm probably good, but that's that one. That is possessions period, okay? Maintenance of the property. So during this possession period, seller shall maintain the property in its present condition until when? Closing? No. Until possession. Until it's delivered to the buyer. Subject to repairs in response to any inspection. So the repairs regarding inspection repairs, are a part of this. I don't know why that's important. I haven't figured that out. Because if at the time of signing the sump pump's broken, then the inspection, I remember now, the inspection report shows that it's broken, and then they fix it. It was fixed after the time of signing, so present condition was 20 days before they fixed the sump pump. So the sump pump was broken when they signed this. They have since fixed it because of an inspection response. So they're adding in that if you fixed anything during the inspection responses, then it has to stay fixed. You can't go break the sump pump. Go, well, hold on. When we signed it, it was broken. Look at the inspection report. Well, you fixed it during the transaction. You can't. That's why that's there. Yeah, this is escaping my brain for a second. So then buyer may inspect the property prior to closing to determine whether seller has complied with this paragraph. So this does apply to closing. It's just that they clarify possession. And I love that they do. They did a good job with that, because if they said closing, then post-closing possession wouldn't be covered. If they say possession, then the at closing box is covered. The after closing boxes are covered. Okay? So present condition until possession is delivered to the buyer, and buyer may inspect the property prior to closing. This is the final walkthrough. It's already in our contract. You don't have to write it in. Buyer reserves the right to do a final walkthrough. No, of course we do. It's right here on line 120. Buyer may inspect the property prior to closing to determine whether seller has complied with this paragraph. And then another big hitter is seller shall remove all debris and personal property not included in the sale. Well, what about paint cans that match our walls? You got to get rid of them unless you get permission from the buyer. What about extra flooring? You better get rid of it unless you get permission from the buyer. What about firewood in the backyard? You better get rid of it unless you have possession from the buyer. What about landscaping bricks? Better get rid of it unless it's like they absolutely have the right to not close and sue you. You cannot leave personal property, debris, trash. What about my trash bin's full? It better not be a closing. Now, it is. It always is. Trash day's tomorrow. We're just going to leave it on the curb. Is that fine? Yes. Great. I got a text message saying it's okay. Okay. Personal property and debris, they didn't go on to all the words like trash and blah, blah, blah. But if you want to know what we mean, go talk to one of these large investment companies buying houses. They want the firewood gone. They want your extra paint gone. They do not want your flooring. Some of them, at least.
We always leave our flooring.
Everybody does. You're doing a nice thing. What you get a lot of times, though, is somebody also leaving their Roundup, their can of Roundup. They're leaving some gas cans. They're leaving garden rakes. They're leaving wood that's 100 years old. That's in
shelves. They don't want any more of those standalone shelves.
Yeah, they're leaving the plastic shelves that fall over. Like, it's all got to be. This house should be clear. Basically, I mean, it's the attached, unattached. Like, if it's not attached, if it's not a part of the property, it needs to be gone. Unless, what about a fridge that they didn't include in the PA? You better sell it or get rid of it. It's not supposed to be there when they get there, because then they have to move it. That costs time. It takes time, takes money. All right. Manage the property. Seller has to present it. When the HVAC goes out, when your seller is in post-closing possession for a month, and the HVAC breaks down and you need a new one, whose responsibility is it? According to the contract, the seller that's staying there for 30 extra days, they just paid a very expensive post-closing possession bill, because that HVAC goes out, they're responsible for it. Okay?
Even though you're closed.
That's right, because this contract says in present condition, which was an operating HVAC. Casualty loss, risk of loss by damage or destruction to the property prior to the closing shall be borne by seller. Crazy. So who needs to be most inclined to make sure the buyer has a working insurance policy in the event there's post-closing possession? The seller. Because they're the ones responsible if this house burns down. Including deductibles. So, if the buyer has has a policy, seller burns the house down on accident while they're in post-closing possession, buyer has a $5,000 deductible, the seller pays it. In the event of any damage or destruction is not fully repaired prior to closing, the buyer at buyer's election may either terminate. Actually, this is the prior to closing. My bad. Sorry, back that train up. Maintenance of property was the one we talked about, possession. Okay. Number 3, casualty loss. Risk of loss by damage or destruction of the property prior to closing shall be borne by the seller. So the seller, obviously, if we've gone through what happens is you go through all the inspection processes, and then we have this shift in weather like we've had, air conditioner doesn't kick on. That's still the seller's problem. It's not like, well, you had your inspections, Mr. Buyer. No, your AC was working. It's not now. You have to still fix it. In the event any damage or destruction is not fully repaired prior to closing, buyer may A, terminate the agreement, or B, elect to close the transaction anyway, in which event seller's right to all real property insurance proceeds resulting from such damage or destruction should be assigned by seller to buyer. So if the buyer continues to purchase the property, the seller has to pay the buyer the insurance money. So big example, this is a real one from me. There's definitely more. About a week before closing, a major thunderstorm comes rolling through here and strikes the house we're selling. Hits it, blows shingles off, puts a big hole in the roof, runs down, melts, kind of hot knife, all the siding all the way to the ground, and blows out some breakers and a water heater. So, I mean, there's $5,000 worth of damage. We backed closing up a little tiny bit and fixed it all with our insurance policy, including the $1,000 deductible, and closed the deal normal. If we didn't have the ability to do that for whatever reason, the buyer had the right to kill the deal. We're not buying it. The thunderstorm just took it out. Or we'll buy it anyway, but when the seller turns it into insurance and gets that $5,000, they have to give it to the buyer. So the buyer could then go and fix the mess. Okay, that's how that works. But you're going to want to make sure that, I mean, it just doesn't come up often, but a seller's responsible all the way through possession for everything. I mean, that's just the end of the story. Now, it does talk about closing in that sense and in insurance, because the buyer is going to put insurance on it when they buy it. That's just the way it is. Cash buyers forget sometimes, but lending ones always have it because the lender requires it. Utilities, municipal services. Seller shall pay for all municipal services and public utility charges through the day of possession. So they have to keep the utilities on, keep it running, and they have to pay for them. This includes sewer bills. Are you ever going to deal with that? No. The sewer bill comes once a quarter, and the 13 days that they had post-closing possession was like $7. Nobody's going back to get their $7. But electric, gas, water, all of that, they're responsible for it. This is the section that home heating fuels right here. This is the section that you're going to point to. What are the risks related to, post-closing possession on either side? This is that section. And most of the time, it's going to be about maintenance of the property. Well, what happens if something goes wrong during this post-closing possession? You're not a landlord. That's why I don't do leases. Even for long post-closing possession, I feel like this protects better than most leases do, because this says the seller is still responsible for all repairs. In a lease, who's responsible for the repair? Not the person living there. It's the person that owns it, which is our buyer. So I don't do leases because of this. Now, could you write that the maintenance of the property is on the tenant? Yeah, you could, but I'd rather just use this. That's why it's here, in my opinion. Home heating fuel, any remaining fuel stored in tanks. This is going to be propane tanks most of the time in the country. Are they to be included in the sale, purchased separately at the going rate, or not applicable? If Zip Forms would let me mark both boxes, I would mark not applicable and to be included in the sale, meaning if it's applicable, it's included. If it's not applicable, it's not applicable. Zip Forms won't let me do that. So I just mark to be included in the sale. Talked about it a second ago. Why do I do that? There's likely no home heating fuel in my house right now, but as a buyer, you really don't know. When you're writing this contract, you haven't called the list agent and say, hey, do you guys have any like hidden propane tanks or anything going on? Like, you haven't done it. You don't know. So I mark to be included in the sale, because if there is one, I want it, because it's running my fireplace behind me. It's not, I have an electric fireplace, but I've seen a little propane tank hidden in a corner outside, covered up, that's the size of like maybe a little bit bigger or the same size as one that runs your gas grill. And all it does is run the fireplace. And if you marked not applicable, then they can take that tank with them. Not a big deal.
It's better to be safe.
But it might as well be safe. People will counter that out all day long. I don't care. It shows me that I'm smarter than them. Because what happens? Like Eli, there's no home heating fuel. Cool. I'll take every ounce of it. No problem. Like, what did that hurt? Absolutely nothing. I'll take all of nothing any day in this scenario. Okay? That's what that's about. If there's any there, it's going to be included in the sale when you mark it like that.
Yeah.
All right? I'm going to hit pause.
Oh, good time.
And we'll start on survey next week, line 133.